My fiancé left me for his ex. Now he's back saying her baby isn't his. The sentence landed like a slap. I didn't see coming on that rain, slick Tuesday evening in late October. The kind of ordinary weeknight where I had just killed the engine in the driveway of the townhouse we once chose together for its quiet cul-de-sac, and the promise of Sunday pancakes on the back patio, my wipers still sweeping away the last sheets of water while the grocery bag on the passenger seat held nothing more exciting than microwave rice and a bottle of cheap Pinot I planned to nurse alone in front of whatever mindless Netflix queue would drown out the echo of his absence. And there he was, Jake, rising from the wet steps like a ghost I had finally stopped expecting, his shoulders hunched inside the same navy peacoat I bought him 2 Christmases ago, hair plastered dark against his forehead, eyes bloodshot in the yellow glow of the porch light I kept forgetting to replace the bulb on, and before I could even form the word no, my body betrayed me by unlocking the front door with fingers that felt detached from the rest of me, the familiar creak of the hinges pulling me back into the living room still arranged exactly as we left it the morning he packed his duffel and told me over cold coffee that he needed to figure out what was real, the throw pillows I had fluffed that same afternoon now slightly askew because I hadn't had the heart to straighten them since, and as the door clicked shut behind us, the scent of his rain-soaked cologne mixed with the faint lavender candle I burned every evening to trick myself into believing the space still belonged to just one person. He started talking in that low, halting voice I used to fall asleep to, explaining how, after he moved in with Lauren, the old fire turned out to be mostly smoke. How her pregnancy announcement had trapped him in a sense of duty that lasted until the baby boy arrived last week, with a shock of red hair and a blood type that didn't match his own, how the paternity test results had arrived via email while he sat in the hospital corridor holding a tiny blue hat he suddenly knew wasn't meant for him, and the words kept coming faster as if he were afraid I would vanish if he paused, how the dates never quite lined up once he let himself look closely, how Lauren finally admitted there had been one night during one of their breakups with a colleague from the event planning firm, and how in the middle of that sterile hospital hallway, the only face he could see was mine, the woman who had patiently waited through his late startup hours and his mood swings and still left little notes in his laptop bag on the mornings he had big pitches. The woman whose laugh he missed more than he had admitted even to himself until the DNA results forced the truth out like a splinter finally surfacing. And I stood there clutching the edge of the kitchen tap island because my knees had gone liquid, the granite cool under my palms the same way it had felt the night I came home early from a client dinner and found the note he left on the counter next to my favourite mug, the one with the tiny chip we never fixed because it made us laugh. And now that same mug sat in the drying rack waiting for tomorrow's 7 a.m. Zoom call where I would pretend to my team that had the dark circles under my eyes were just seasonal allergies, while inside I catalogued every way I had apparently not been enough. My graphic design job too steady, my weekend hikes too predictable, my love too quiet compared to whatever drama Lauren offered. And yet here he was offering the baby's non-paternity like a twisted gift, as if the destruction of his detour somehow restored the path back to me, and the anger rose so fast and hot I tasted metal, remembering the exact afternoon 3 weeks after he left when my sister dropped off lasagna, and found me on the bathroom floor scrolling through Lauren's Instagram stories of ultrasound pics captioned "Second chances feel like home." How I had thrown my phone across the room and watched the screen crack in the same pattern my heart had already past shattered. How I had spent the following months rebuilding in tiny stubborn increments. Booking the solo therapy sessions where Dr. Patel gently asked me to name the parts of myself I had outsourced to Jake's approval. Signing up for the 6 a.m. spin classes that left my legs aching, so the rest of me had permission to hurt too. Learning to cook single portions without the soundtrack of his terrible singing opera along to the radio. All the small domestic survivals that had started to feel like armour until this moment stripped it away again. And when he reached for my wrist with the same tentative fingers that once traced the engagement ring I now kept in the back of the sock drawer, I jerked back hard enough that the motion sent the grocery bag tipping and the Pinot rolling across the floor like a slow accusation. The glass bottle glinting under the overhead light as he whispered, "Emma, I know I don't deserve even 5 minutes, but I'm here because the second I saw that test result, the only thing I wanted was to come home to you." And the raw honesty in his voice cracked something deep inside the place where I had stored the version of us that still felt possible. The late night talks about baby names and whether we'd need a minivan someday, the way he used to bring me coffee exactly how I liked it. Oat milk, 1 sugar. On the mornings I had tight deadlines, and I could see the guilt carved into the new lines around his mouth. The way his shoulders curved inward as if carrying the weight of every unanswered text I had sent in those first brutal weeks. Every voicemail I deleted without listening, and yet the pain far was still so fresh that when he asked if he could sit down for just a minute, the word that left my mouth was a hoarse no. That tasted like every tear I had swallowed since April. Because letting him stay even for 5 minutes would mean admitting the hope I had buried under layers of rage and self-protection was still breathing, still treacherous, still whispering that maybe the baby not being his was the universe's cruel way of handing us back the future we had lost. And as the rain intensified against the windows, turning the street outside into a blurred watercolour of porch lights and parked cars, I told him to leave, my voice steadier than I felt, told him I needed the night to breathe without him in it, and he nodded once, eyes glistening, before stepping back into the downpour with the quiet promise that he wouldn't disappear again, the door closing softly behind him the way it had the morning he left. Only this time the house didn't feel quite as empty, just heavier, the confrontation settling into my bones like the damp chill that would linger until morning when I would wake to the same coffee mug and the same cracked phone screen and the same terrifying question of whether I was strong enough to decide what came next, the shocking discovery already rewriting the careful script of independence I had been writing for myself one painful day at a time. That first full night after Jake's return stretched into something unrecognisable, the house settling around me with a heaviness I hadn't felt even in the weeks immediately following his departure, when silence had at least been predictable. Now every creak of the floorboards sounded like hesitation, like him changing his mind outside the door he'd promised to leave closed, and I moved through the motions of routine with mechanical precision, unpacking the grocery bag I dropped earlier, the Pinot bottle miraculously unbroken rolling back into my hand, though I left it unopened on the counter because the thought of drinking alone felt too much like surrender, too much like the nights I'd spent scrolling through old photos of us at the lake house last summer, his arm around my waist, both of us sunburned and laughing at something the camera hadn't captured, and instead I filled the electric kettle, the soft click of it starting up the only sound besides the refrigerator's low hum and the persistent patter of rain against the skylight cedar in the kitchen, rain that had followed me inside like an unwanted guest. I carried the mug, my chipped favourite one, the one he used to tease me about keeping because it's got character, M. Upstairs to the bedroom we once shared, the stairs groaning under steps that felt slower than usual, each one giving me time to rehearse the arguments I wouldn't get to make tonight, because he wasn't here to hear them, time to feel the ache settle deeper into my chest where hope and fury wrestled without resolution. The bed looked too big again, the duvet still wrinkled from this morning when I'd kicked free of it, after another dream in which he came back only to leave again, and I sat on my side, always my side, even after he was gone, staring at the empty pillow that still held the faint ghost of his shampoo scent from months ago. Or maybe I was imagining it, projecting memory onto cotton, because the alternative was admitting how thoroughly I had erased him from the room. His books gone from the nightstand, his half of the closet now holding winter coats I rarely wore. The framed photo of us at my cousin's wedding moved to the guest room drawer where I wouldn't have to see his easy smile every time I reached for socks. I tried to read the novel I'd been nursing for weeks open to the same page, words sliding past without purchase, because my mind kept replaying his face in the porch light, the way his voice broke on the only thing I wanted was to come home to you, the sentence landing somewhere between confession and plea, and I hated how part of me wanted to believe it. Not because I still loved him in the uncomplicated way I once had, but because believing it would mean the last 7 months hadn't been wasted. That the therapy appointments where I learned to say, I am allowed to grieve what I thought we were, hadn't been lies. That the mornings I forced myself to eat toast even when my stomach rebelled hadn't been practiced for nothing. Around 11 I texted my sister Mara the bare facts. Jake showed up. Baby isn't his. He wants back ... And her reply came almost instantly. 3 question marks followed by do not let him in tonight. Call me tomorrow? Love you. I didn't answer because typing would have meant deciding what I felt. And right then feeling anything clearly seemed impossible. Instead I opened the sock drawer, pulled out the velvet box that still held the engagement ring he'd slid onto my finger under string lights at the rooftop bar downtown 2 years ago. The diamond catching the bedside lamp in tiny prisms that danced across the ceiling like trapped stars. And I held it in my palm until the metal warmed to my skin, until the weight of it reminded me how light it had felt sick the first time, how certain I'd been that certainty itself was enough. Downstairs the clock in the living room chimed midnight, a sound I usually found comforting but tonight registered as accusation. Another hour survived without him, another hour survived wanting him anyway, and I finally lay back, phone face down on the nightstand so I wouldn't check for messages I both dreaded and craved, the sheet cool against my legs, the pillow damp where silent tears had started without permission. Sleep refused to come cleanly. Instead I drifted in fragments, waking every hour or so to the same loop, the hospital corridor he described, the blue hat in his hands, Lauren's voice admitting the colleague, the way his eyes had searched mine for forgiveness he hadn't yet earned and maybe never would. Around 3 I gave up pretending I could rest and padded downstairs in the dark, avoiding the creaky third step out of habit, flicked on only the under-cabinet light so the kitchen stayed soft-edged, and made tea I didn't drink, just held the mug until it cooled, staring at the spot on the floor where the Pinot had rolled earlier, at the faint smear of rain he'd tracked in that I hadn't bothered to wipe away. The confession he'd started on the porch had been incomplete. He hadn't told me how long he'd suspected, how many nights he'd lain beside her wondering if the timeline fit, how many times he'd thought of calling me before the test results made the decision for him. And the gaps in what he'd said felt deliberate, protective, maybe of himself more than me, and that realization stung fresh, reminded me, that even in returning he was still choosing what pieces to show. By 4:30 the rain had eased to a drizzle, the streetlights outside smearing gold across wet pavement, and I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open to an empty document titled Pros and Cons. Again, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat I couldn't match, because listing reasons to let him back in felt like betrayal of the woman who had finally started sleeping through the night without checking prop the door, and listing reasons to keep him gone felt like punishing us both for a mistake that wasn't entirely his or mine. When dawn began to grey the windows I closed the laptop, untouched, and climbed the stairs one more time, slid under the covers still wearing yesterday's sweater, and let exhaustion pull me under at last, the last coherent thought before sleep claiming me a quiet, terrified admission that the night had not made anything clearer, only heavier, only more honest, and that tomorrow I would have to decide whether the man who had once been my future was still allowed to walk back into the wreckage he'd left, or whether the space I'd carved for myself in his absence had grown too precious to give up, even for the fragile, flickering chance that we might rebuild something scarred but real. The morning after that sleepless night arrived grey and reluctant, the kind of February Saturday where the sky stayed low and the air smelled faintly of wet concrete even inside the house, and I woke with the taste of unshed tears still coating my tongue, the chipped mug from last night's untouched tea sitting cold on the nightstand like evidence of my refusal to collapse completely. My phone buzzed once. Jake, a single message sent at 6:42 a.m. I'm at the coffee shop on Maple. I'll wait until noon if you want to talk. No pressure. Just here ... And I stared at the words until the screen dimmed, feeling the pull of old habit warring against the new boundaries I'd been teaching myself to hold, boundaries that had started as rigid walls and were slowly softening into something more like caution tape, bright enough to notice but not impossible to step over if the step felt earned. I showered longer than necessary, letting the hot water pound against my shoulders until the steam clouded the mirror and I could pretend the blur was only condensation. Not the way my reflection looked softer around the edges now that anger had burned off some of its sharpest heat, then dressed in the oldest sweatshirt I owned. The one from college with the faded logo that Jake used to steal and wear when we stayed up late editing his pitch decks. And drove the 10 minutes to my sister's house instead of the coffee shop, because I needed someone who knew the whole ugly timeline without me having to narrate it again. Mara opened the door before I rang the bell, arms already open, and pulled me inside without a word, the familiar chaos of her kitchen wrapping around me like a blanket. Liam's soccer cleats by the back door still caked with last weekend's mud, the faint scent of burnt toast lingering from breakfast, her 13-year-old daughter Sophie sprawled on the couch with headphones and a tablet, glancing up just long enough to offer a small uncertain wave before returning to whatever show was keeping her from asking why Aunt Emma looked like she hadn't slept since Christmas. We sat at the scarred oak table Mara had rescued from a curb years ago, coffee steaming between us, and I told her everything in the flat, careful voice I'd practiced in the car. Jake, on the porch, the paternity test, the colleague, the hospital hallway, the way he looked at me like I was still the safest place he knew, and she listened without interrupting, only reaching across once to squeeze my wrist when my voice cracked on the part about the blue hat he'd held and then set down. When I finished, she exhaled slowly, the sound of someone deciding how much truth to give at once. "You don't owe him immediacy," she said. "You don't owe him access to your days just because his detour imploded. But if you're even considering letting him near you again, you protect Sophie and Liam first. No blurry lines, no maybe he'll drop by, no letting him charm his way back into family dinners until you're sure the ground under your own feet isn't shifting." I nodded because she was right. The kids had already absorbed too much of my grief in sideways glances and cancelled plans, Sophie asking once last fall why Uncle Jake wasn't coming to her cello recital anymore. Liam quietly moving the framed photo of the four of us at the pumpkin patch from the mantel to his bedroom shelf without explanation. Mara suggested ground rules before any real conversation. No unannounced visits, no texting after 10 at night, full transparency about where he'd been staying since the hospital he'd moved into a month-to-month studio near his office, he'd said last night, and, most importantly, no promises about the future until we'd both had time to sit with the wreckage. I left her house around 11 feeling lighter in the chest but heavier in the limbs, the way you do after handing over part of a burden you've carried alone too long, and on the drive home I detoured past the park where Jake and I used to walk on Sunday mornings. The benches still damp from overnight rain, a young family pushing a stroller along the path reminding me how close we'd once come to being fuck that picture, how the miscarriage 2 years ago had quietly shifted our timeline without ever erasing the longing. Back at the townhouse I texted him one line. "We can talk tomorrow, my place, 4 p.m. bring nothing but honesty." No expectations, and spent the afternoon cleaning in the furious, methodical way I used to when deadlines loomed, scrubbing the kitchen grout with a toothbrush, wiping down baseboards, folding laundry I'd left in the dryer for days, each task a small reclaiming of control, a reminder that the house had kept standing without him and would keep standing whatever came next. When Sophie called later to ask if I'd come for movie night tomorrow, I said yes, then added, careful not to lie but not to overshare. There might be someone else here too, just for a little while. We're figuring things out. She was quiet for a beat, long enough that I heard the cartoon soundtrack in the background pause, then said simply, "Okay, as long as you're okay," and the trust in her voice nearly undid me, because she was still a child who believed adults could fix what they broke, and I wasn't sure yet if I qualified as one who could. Evening fell with the slow inevitability of winter dusk. Take-out containers from the Thai place down the street spread across the coffee table, while I half-watched a documentary about urban wildlife I'd put on for noise, my phone silent beside me because I'd turned off notifications, letting the quiet stretch until it felt less like punishment and more like space to breathe. Around 9 I opened the sock drawer again, took out the ring box, and this time set it on the dresser instead of hiding it away, not a decision to wear it but an acknowledgement that it still existed, that the story it represented hadn't ended so much as paused on a jagged, uncertain page. Sleep came in shallow waves that night, dreams flickering between the porch confrontation and fragments of our old life. Jake laughing in the kitchen while he burned eggs, me resting my head on his shoulder during late-night drives home from friends' houses. And when I woke to pale morning light filtering through the blinds, I felt the first faint stirrings of something beyond raw pain. Not forgiveness yet, not even trust, but a cautious curiosity about whether the man who'd walked away could become someone capable of staying through the hard parts, and whether I could let myself want that without losing the woman I'd become in the months he was gone. The afternoon appointment loomed like a threshold, and as I made coffee, oat milk, 1 sugar, the way he used to bring it to me, I realised the real boundary I was setting wasn't just for him. It was for me too, a line drawn in the ordinary clutter of everyday life that said whatever happened at 4 o'clock, I would not disappear into the version of us that had cracked under pressure. That the protecting I was doing now started with the woman staring back at me from the kitchen window's faint reflection, tired-eyed but still standing, still deciding. Sunday morning arrived with a brittle clarity, the February sun slicing through the blinds in thin, unforgiving strips that made every dust mote visible, every small imperfection in the room I'd cleaned yesterday now impossible to ignore, and I woke before the alarm with the decision already half made in the quiet hours between 3 and 5 when sleep had finally given up pretending to hold me. I needed distance. Not the permanent kind I'd rehearsed in therapy notes titled What Staying Gone Looks Like, but the temporary, deliberate kind that would let me hear my own thoughts without the gravitational pull of his presence, without the way his familiar silhouette in the doorway still made my pulse stutter between memory and mistrust. So I packed an overnight bag with the efficiency of someone who'd done this once before, though last time it had been him doing the leaving, jeans, the soft grey sweater Mara had given me for my birthday, toothbrush, The journal Dr. Patel encouraged me to keep even when the entries were only fragments of sentences that trailed off into ellipses. I left a note on the kitchen counter, not for Jake, who wasn't due until 4, but for myself, taped to the fridge so I'd see it when I came back. Went to the cabin. Back Monday night. Phone on, but give me space. E. The cabin was the small rented place on the lake an hour north. The one we'd booked for our would-be honeymoon before everything unravelled, a spot I'd quietly kept reserving one weekend a month since September, because being there alone had started to feel less like punishment and more like proof I could still find quiet without him in it. Driving up the highway, the radio stayed off. Instead, I listened to the rhythm of tyres on wet asphalt, the occasional hiss of passing trucks, my own breathing steady but shallow, and when the exit for the lake appeared, I felt the first loosening in my chest, as though the miles were peeling away layers of the anger that had calcified around my heart. The cabin smelled of pine and last season's wood smoke when I unlocked the door. I dropped the bag inside, opened windows to let the cold air chase out the staleness, then walked down to the dock where the water lay flat and slate grey under a sky that hadn't yet decided whether to rain again. I sat with my legs dangling over the edge, sneakers brushing the surface, and let the thoughts come without trying to order them. How Jake's confession on the porch had cracked open a door I'd nailed shut. How the baby not being his changed the geometry of his betrayal, but didn't erase the months I'd spent learning to live around the hole he'd left. How part of me wanted to punish him by staying gone forever, and another part, the quieter, more stubborn part, wanted to know if the man who came back was someone I could choose again, not out of habit, but out of clear-eyed want. Around noon, I called Mara from the porch swing, the chain creaking softly as I rocked, and told her where I was. She didn't lecture, just asked if I'd eaten I hadn't, and reminded me to charge my phone in case the signal dropped later. We talked about Sophie's upcoming science fair project, something with baking soda volcanoes that had already erupted prematurely on the kitchen table, and Liam's insistence on wearing mismatched socks to school as a form of protest against uniformity, and the normalcy of it grounded me, reminded me there was still a world beyond the wreckage of my engagement. After we hung up, I walked the trail that looped the lake, boots sinking into soft mud, passing other weekenders with dogs and couples holding hands. And for the first time in months, the sight of paired figures didn't feel like a personal indictment. It felt like background noise, proof that life continued in its ordinary pairings and partings whether I participated or not. Back at the cabin, I built a small fire in the stone hearth, the kindling catching quickly because I'd learned the trick last fall, crumpled newspaper first, then thin sticks in a loose teepee, and sat cross-legged on the rug with my laptop open to the document I'd started Friday night. Pros and cons. Again, only this time I added a third column, non-negotiables. Transparency about finances, no more secrets kept to protect me. Couples therapy if we moved forward at all. Separate bedrooms until trust felt less like a theory and more like muscle memory. I typed until my fingers ached, the cursor no longer blinking accusingly but steadily, as though the list itself was building a scaffolding I could stand on. When the sky darkened, I made pasta from the pantry staples I kept here, tomato sauce, garlic, a little chili flake for heat, and ate standing at the counter the way I used to when Jake was working late, and I didn't want to sit alone at the table, though tonight the solitude felt chosen rather than endured. Around 7, my phone lit with his text. Got your note. I'll respect the space. I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to. Take the time you need. No pleading, no guilt-tripping emojis, just the plain sentence that somehow carried more weight than any long paragraph could have. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I opened the ring box I'd slipped into my bag almost without thinking, set it on the mantel where the firelight caught the diamond and sent small rainbows dancing across the log walls, and watched them move until the flames settled to embers. Later, wrapped in the quilt from the couch, I scrolled through old photos. Not to torture myself, but to catalogue what I'd loved about us before the fracture. The way he'd tilt his head when listening, really listening, how he'd always pause at crosswalks to make sure I was beside him. The quiet mornings when he'd trace lazy circles on my back while we both pretended we could stay in bed another hour. The ache was still there, but it had company now, curiosity, a tentative willingness to imagine a different ending that didn't require erasing the pain, but required walking through it together, or at least side by side. Sleep came easier that night, the lake lapping softly outside like a lullaby I hadn't earned but accepted anyway, and when I woke to birdsong and pale dawn light, I felt the shift. Not resolution, not yet, but the beginning of rules that weren't just for him. They were for the version of me who refused to be defined only by what he'd broken. I packed up slowly, leaving the fire's ashes swept neat, the windows closed against the coming week, and on the drive home I rehearsed the conversation waiting at 4 o'clock. Not as confrontation, but as negotiation, the first real one we'd had since he walked out last spring. The townhouse looked the same when I pulled into the driveway, but I felt different crossing the threshold. Still bruised, still wary, but carrying the faint, hard-won outline of what I would and would not accept. The space I'd taken proving I could breathe without him close enough to touch, and maybe, just maybe, learning that breathing room was exactly what might let us try again without suffocating under the weight of what came before. Monday evening crept in with the slow drag of rush hour headlights past the townhouse windows, the sky already navy by the time I pulled into the driveway after dropping off the cabin keys at the rental office and stopping for takeout Thai I didn't really want, but knew I should eat, the paper bag warm against my thigh as I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet that felt different now. Less empty, more expectant, like the house itself was waiting to see what version of me would walk through the rest of the week. Jake had texted once while I was on the road, "I'll be there at 4 if you still want to talk. If not, just say the word dot." and I'd replied with a simple 4 works. The 3 words typed and deleted 3 times before I hit send, because even agreeing to 30 minutes in the same room felt like handing over a fragile piece of the armour I'd welded together over months of mornings alone. I changed out of the jeans I'd worn to the lake into leggings and the same grey sweater, not because I cared how I looked to him, but because the fabric held the faint scent of pine smoke and lake air, a reminder that I'd spent the weekend deciding things without his voice in my head. At exactly 4 the doorbell chimed, soft, almost apologetic. And when I opened it, he stood there in the same peacoat, hands empty except for a small paper sack he lifted slightly. "Coffee," he said, voice low. "Oat milk, 1 sugar. Figured you might not have made any." I stepped aside without speaking, let him in, closed the door behind him, and the click of the latch sounded final in a way it hadn't last week. We ended up at the kitchen island because the living room couch felt too intimate, too much like old evenings when we'd lean into each other over laptops. Here the granite between us was a necessary barrier, cool under my forearms as I unwrapped the takeout containers. Pad see ew for me, green curry for him, the same orders we'd placed 100 times before everything shifted. He didn't push conversation right away. Instead, he opened the lid on his curry, steam rising in lazy curls, and waited until I'd taken the first bite before saying, "I started seeing someone too. A therapist. Not couples yet. Just me. Thursdays at 6. Her name's Dr. Ningwen. She's helping me figure out why I ran instead of talking." The admission landed without fanfare. No dramatic pause for applause, just the quiet fact of it placed between us like one of the takeout napkins, and I felt the first small crack in the wall I'd built around the question of whether he'd done any real work or was simply riding the wave of guilt back to familiar shores. I chewed slowly, tasting chili and basil more sharply than usual, then set my fork down. "I've been seeing Dr. Patel since July," I said. "Individual. She's the one who told me to make the list of non-negotiables. Transparency. No secrets kept for my own good. Therapy if we even get that far. Separate bedrooms until..." I stopped, because saying "until trust" out loud felt too exposing, too much like admitting I was already imagining a future where bedrooms might not stay separate forever. He nodded once, eyes on his plate, then looked up. "I can do that. All of it. I've got the studio lease through June, so space isn't an issue. And I'll sign whatever release you need so Dr. Nguyen can talk to Dr. Patel if it comes to joint sessions later." The practicality of it, the logistics of accountability, should have felt cold, but instead it steadied something inside me, made the possibility of trying again seem less like jumping off a cliff and more like crossing a series of small, well-lit bridges. We ate in near silence after that, the only sounds the clink of forks, the refrigerator cycling on, the distant hum of a neighbour's leaf blower wrapping up before full dark, and when the containers were mostly empty I pushed mine away and said the thing I'd rehearsed on the drive home. "I'm not ready to forgive you." Not even close. But I'm willing to see what happens if we both keep showing up for the hard conversations instead of running from them. He exhaled, long and slow, the sound carrying relief and something heavier. Maybe recognition that this wasn't absolution, only a door cracked open an inch. "That's more than I deserve right now," he said, and for once the words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded earned, spoken from the place where he'd spent the last week sitting with the mess he'd made. We cleared the island together without asking, muscle memory guiding our movements, me rinsing plates, him stacking them in the dishwasher. The ordinary choreography feeling both familiar and foreign, like dancing with someone after they've changed height or learned new steps. When the kitchen was tidy again, he lingered by the sink, drying his hands on a dish towel, then said quietly, "Can I ask one thing tonight? Not a promise, just, can I see you again this week? Coffee, a walk, whatever feels safe. No pressure to decide anything bigger." I considered saying no, letting the silence stretch until it became its own answer, but the weekend at the cabin had taught me that space didn't have to mean absence. It could mean breathing room for both of us. "Wednesday," I said, "after my 6 o'clock session with Dr. Patel. Meet me at the park by the fountain. 30 minutes. If it feels okay, we can do it again the next week." He nodded, relief flickering across his face before he schooled it back to careful neutral. "Wednesday. I'll be there." He left shortly after, the door closing with the same soft finality, and I stood in the hallway listening to his footsteps fade down the walk, the porch light clicking on automatically as dusk settled fully outside. Alone again, I opened my journal on the coffee table, wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, and listed 3 things: the coffee he brought exactly right, the name of his therapist, the way he didn't push when I set the boundary. Small acts, barely vulnerabilities, but they felt like the first tentative threads of contact after months of radio silence, fragile as spider silk but real. I closed the journal, carried it upstairs, and for the first time since he'd appeared on the porch I didn't check the sock drawer for the ring. Instead I left it on the dresser where I'd placed it last week, the velvet box catching the hallway light as I passed, a quiet marker that something old was still in the room with me, waiting, not to be slipped back on tomorrow, but to be considered without panic, without the immediate need to hide it away. Sleep came in longer stretches that night, broken only once by the sound of rain starting again, soft against the roof like fingers tapping a question I was finally beginning to answer in small, deliberate steps. Yes, I was willing to try seeing what healing looked like when both people stayed in the room, when the hurt was named instead of buried, when the first shared vulnerability wasn't a grand gesture, but a correctly made coffee, a named therapist, a half-hour walk scheduled like any other appointment in the slow, everyday work of rebuilding what had once felt unbreakable, and now felt possible only because we were both choosing, cautiously, honestly, to show up for it. Wednesday evening arrived wrapped in the kind of damp chill that seeps through coat seams and makes the streetlights look softer, hazier, as I walked from Dr. Patel's office 6 blocks to the park fountain where we'd agreed to meet, my session still echoing in my head. Not the usual unpacking of grief this time, but the careful mapping of what small risks I was willing to take, how naming the fear out aloud in that quiet room with the tissue box always within reach had made it feel less like a monster and more like a shadow I could learn to walk beside. Dr. Patel had asked me to notice my body during the conversation tonight, where tension lived, where breath caught. And as I approached the fountain, I felt it first in my shoulders, the instinctive hunch forward as though bracing for impact, then lower in my stomach, a flutter that wasn't quite nausea anymore, but something closer to anticipation laced with memory. Jake was already there, sitting on the curved stone bench that faced the water, hands clasped between his knees, collar turned up against the wind, and when he saw me he stood without rushing, offering only a small nod that carried no expectation beyond the 30 minutes we'd agreed on. We didn't hug, neither of us moved to close that last distance. But we fell into step along the gravel path that circled the pond, the crunch under our shoes, the only sound for the first minute until I said, "Dr. Patel asked me today what one honest thing I could say to you without protecting either of us from it." He glanced sideways, waiting, not prompting, and I kept my eyes on the ducks drifting in lazy circles on the dark water. I still wake up some mornings and the first thing I feel is relief that you're not here, because it means I don't have to wonder if today's the day you'll leave again. Then the second thing is grief that you're not here, and I hate that both can be true at the same time. The words came out steadier than I'd expected, no tremor in my voice, just the raw fact of them hanging between us like mist off the pond. He walked another few steps before answering, voice low enough that I had to tilt my head to catch it over the wind. I wake up thinking the same thing, only reversed. Relief that I finally told the truth, then terror that the truth might mean I've lost you for good. I don't know how to make that terror useful instead of paralysing yet, but I'm trying. We kept moving, passing the playground where kids' laughter usually echoed, but tonight was empty except for the creak of swings in the breeze, and something in the rhythm of our footsteps, close but not touching, felt like the first real joint conversation we'd had since before he left. Not the porch confrontation or the kitchen island takeout logistics, but something slower, more unguarded. Around the far curve of the path he stopped under a street lamp, the light pooling gold around our feet, and asked if we could sit for the rest of the time. I nodded, and we took the bench nearest the water, close enough that our coat sleeves brushed when either of us shifted. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his inside pocket, creased, handled, and handed it to me without flourish. Dr. Engwin gave me homework. Write down the deeper things I ran from, not just the surface stuff about Lauren or work stress. I figured you deserved to see it before I decide whether it's worth saying out loud in the same room someday. I unfolded it carefully, the handwriting familiar from years of grocery lists and birthday cards, and read in the lamplight. Fear of failing at fatherhood, the way his own dad had failed him in quiet, accumulating ways. Shame that he'd built a startup on charisma instead of substance, and then watched it stall while pretending everything was fine. The way my steadiness, my willingness to stay through late nights and cancelled plans, had started to feel like pressure instead of safety. Pressure he turned into resentment without ever naming it until it was too late. The list wasn't long, maybe 8 bullet points, but each one carried the weight of things he'd never said, not even in the months we were planning a wedding. I handed it back without comment at first, then after a long breath said, "Thank you for writing it. I don't know if I'm ready to hear all of it spoken yet, but seeing it helps. It makes the leaving feel less random." He folded the paper again, tucked it away, and for the first time since he'd come back his hand moved toward mine. Not grabbing, just resting palm up on the bench between us, an open question. I looked at it for several heartbeats, feeling the old reflex to pull away war with the newer one to test what trust might feel like in small doses, and then I placed my hand in his, not lacing fingers, just resting skin against skin, the contact cool at first from the night air, but warming slowly. Neither of us spoke while we sat like that. The fountain burbled behind us, a jogger's footsteps passed on the path, headlights swept across the parking lot in the distance, and the simple act of holding still together felt enormous, like naming the deeper issues without needing to solve them tonight. When my phone timer chimed softly at 30 minutes I didn't move right away, he waited until I slid my hand free, then stood with me. "Same time next week?" he asked, and I nodded. Same bench. Same 30 minutes. We walked back toward the entrance in silence that wasn't heavy anymore, just full of the things said, and the things still waiting, and when we reached the gate he paused. "Emma, I know this isn't forgiveness. I know it's barely even a beginning. But sitting here tonight, holding your hand for 5 minutes, felt like the first time in a year I wasn't running from myself." I met his eyes then, really looked, and saw the same raw honesty that had cracked me open on the porch, only now it didn't feel like a weapon turned inward. It felt like an offering. "It felt like something for me too," I said, the admission small but true. We parted at the gate, he toward his studio, me toward home, and the walk back to my car carried a different weight. Not lighter exactly, but distributed differently, shared for the first time since he'd walked out. At home, I lit the lavender candle I'd started burning after he left, sat on the couch with my journal, and wrote only one line, held his hand. Didn't run, didn't stay forever, just stayed for 30 minutes. I closed the book, blew out the candle, and climbed the stairs to bed, the ring box still on the dresser catching moonlight through the blinds, no longer a secret to hide but a quiet witness to the slow, tentative steps we were taking toward whatever came after the hurt. Same room, same city, Same scarred hearts learning, one small vulnerability at a time. That closeness could be rebuilt not by erasing the past, but by naming it together in the lamplight, in the quiet between footsteps, in the careful open palm that waited without demanding. The idea for the weekend away came from Dr. Patel during my Thursday session, slipped in almost casually between questions about boundaries and progress. Sometimes a contained change of scenery can test what's rebuilding without the safety net of daily routines, familiar places, shared tasks, the quiet moments that used to feel easy. She didn't suggest where or how long, just left the seed there, and by Friday morning it had sprouted into something I couldn't ignore, the memory of the lake cabin still fresh enough to make me wonder what might happen if we returned to a place that once held our future plans instead of my solo recovery. I texted Jake that afternoon, weekend at the lake cabin. Friday after work to Sunday afternoon. Separate rooms. No big talks unless they happen naturally. Just being in the same space for 2 days. And his reply took less than a minute. I'll pack light. Thank you for trusting me with this. We drove up separately to keep the arrival low pressure. I left straight from the office after tying up loose ends on a client project. He met me there an hour later in his own car. And when I pulled into the gravel drive, the cabin looked the same as last time. Weathered cedar siding. The porch light I always left on a timer. The lake beyond it flat and pewter, under a sky threatening snow flurries. I unloaded groceries, first eggs, bread, coffee, the makings of simple dinners, and by the time his headlights swept the windows I had the kettle on, and the fire already crackling in the hearth, small domestic acts that felt like claiming territory without shutting him out. He stepped inside carrying only a duffel and a paper bag of apples from the roadside stand we used to stop at. We exchanged a quiet, hey, no hug, no lingering look, just the practical rhythm of settling in. He took the smaller bedroom at the back. I kept the main one with the lake view. And then we moved through the evening like people learning a new dance. I chopped vegetables for soup while he set the table with mismatched plates we'd bought together years ago on a whim, the clink of ceramic familiar yet careful, as though both of us were measuring the weight of each ordinary sound. Dinner was quiet at first, the soup steaming between us, the fire popping softly, until he said, I keep thinking about the weekend we booked this place for. The one that never happened, I nodded, stirring my bowl. I kept the reservation after you left. Came here alone a few times. It stopped feeling like ours and started feeling like mine. He looked down at his spoon, then back up. I'm glad it became yours. I'm sorry I made it necessary. The apology landed without defensiveness, and instead of brushing it aside, I let it sit, let the silence after it stretch until it felt less like awkwardness and more like space we could both occupy. After we cleared the dishes, we walked down to the dock together, coat zipped against the cold, the air sharp with pine and the promise of snow. The water lapped gently at the pilings, and we stood side by side, not touching, but close enough that our breath clouds mingled in the beam of the porch light behind us. He spoke first this time, voice low. Dr. Nguyen asked me last week what forgiveness would look like from my side. Not asking for it, but giving it to myself so I could stop punishing us both. I told her I didn't know yet, but sitting here tonight, I think it starts with accepting that I hurt you in ways I can't undo, and the best I can do is show up differently from now on. I watched the dark water, felt the cold creep into my fingertips, and answered, forgiveness isn't a switch. It's more like thawing. Slow, uneven, some parts still frozen even when others soften. I'm thawing, Jake. Not all the way, but enough to be here. We stayed until our noses went numb, then walked back inside, the warmth of the cabin wrapping around us like an exhale. Saturday unfolded in small, unforced pieces. Morning coffee on the porch while snow dusted the pines. A hike along the trail where we pointed out deer tracks without needing to fill every silence. Lunch of grilled cheese and tomato soup eaten, standing at the counter, because the table felt too formal for how easy the moment had become. In the afternoon, he suggested we build the fire higher and red. Him with the novel he'd brought, me with the journal I'd started carrying everywhere. And for 2 hours we sat on opposite ends of the couch, legs stretched toward the hearth, the only sounds page turns and the occasional pop of sap in the logs. At one point I shifted, my socked foot brushing his calf, and neither of us moved away, the contact so small it could have been accidental but wasn't, a wordless permission to let proximity feel safe again. Dinner that night was pasta with the last of the sauce from the pantry, wine poured into the same mismatched glasses we'd used on our first trip here, and after we ate we stayed at the table talking, not about the betrayal or the baby or the months apart, but about quieter things. The way the startup he'd poured himself into had finally secured new funding last month, how my latest design project had landed me a promotion I hadn't told anyone about yet, how Sophie had won her science fair with a baking soda volcano that erupted red food colouring like real lava, how Liam still wore mismatched socks every Wednesday as his personal rebellion. The conversation flowed without strain, laughter slipping in unexpectedly when he mimicked Liam's dramatic explanation of uniformity oppression, and when the fire died to embers we moved to the couch again, closer this time, my head eventually resting on his shoulder while we watched the flames flicker low, his arm around me tentative at first, then steady when I didn't pull away. Physical closeness came slowly after that, his fingers tracing my wrist, my hand finding his under the quilt we'd pulled over our laps, and when we finally stood to go to bed, he paused in the hallway, looked at me with the same searching eyes from the porch that first night, and asked, "Can I kiss you? Not because it fixes anything, just because I've missed you." I nodded, and the kiss was careful, almost reverent. Lips brushing, then pressing, then parting long enough to breathe each other's air. Nothing urgent or desperate, just the quiet return of something we'd both thought lost. We didn't go further that night. Separate bedrooms stayed separate, but the doors remained open, hallway light spilling across floorboards like an unspoken promise. Sunday morning we woke to fresh snow blanketing the world outside, made breakfast together, eggs scrambled with too much cheese the way we both liked, and packed up slowly, no rush to leave the bubble we'd created. On the drive home, still in separate cars, but with a plan to meet for coffee near my place that evening, I felt the shift settle deep. Not healed, not perfect, but reconnected in the small, hard-earned ways that mattered more than grand declarations. The weekend had tested us not with drama or ultimatums, but with the ordinary work of sharing space, naming fears, holding still when instinct said run. And we'd come through it scarred but steadier, forgiveness emerging not as a single moment, but as a series of choices to stay, to touch, to listen, to laugh again in a place that once held our plans and now held something new. The tentative, real possibility of a future built on the ashes of what we'd broken, stronger because we'd both chosen to sift through them together. A year to the day after that rain-soaked Tuesday when Jake appeared on the porch with the paternity test results still burning a hole in his pocket, the townhouse kitchen smelled of cinnamon and fresh ground coffee instead of damp wool and unspoken accusations. The calendar on the fridge flipped to February 2026 with Sophie's cello recital circled in green marker and Liam's basketball tournament bracket taped beside it like a colourful accusation of normal life continuing whether we were ready or not. I stood at the island stirring oatmeal, steel cut, the slow kind that takes 20 minutes and forces patience. While Jake moved behind me setting out bowls, his shoulder brushing mine in the narrow space between counter and table. The contact no longer tentative but habitual, the way it used to be before everything fractured, only now carrying the quiet knowledge of how easily habits can break and how much harder they are to rebuild. The ring was back on my finger, not the original diamond solitaire he'd given me under string lights, but a simpler band we'd chosen together last October during a weekend in the city, plain platinum with tiny etched waves along the inside, because we both liked the reminder that even calm water has movement underneath. We hadn't rushed the wedding, hadn't even set a date, just agreed that the promise felt different this time, earned, not assumed, and that was enough for now. The oatmeal bubbled softly, steam curling up to fog the window where frost still clung to the edges despite the weak morning sun, and when Jake reached past me for the brown sugar, his hand lingered on my waist for a second. A small anchor that said good morning without words, the same way he'd started doing again 6 months ago after we'd spent a long session with Dr. Ewan and Dr. Patel in the same happen room for the first time, naming the ways resentment had masqueraded as love until it didn't anymore. We sat at the table to eat, knees touching under the wood we'd sanded, and refinished ourselves last summer in a burst of restless energy. The radio on low playing the same public station jazz we used to wake to on lazy Sundays. Conversation drifted in easy fragments. Liam's latest mismatched sock protest had escalated to neon green shoelaces. Sophie was nervous about her solo but practicing extra in the garage, so the neighbours probably thought we were starting a band. And between bites Jake said quietly, I was thinking about driving up to the lake this weekend. Just us. No agenda. See if the cabin still feels like ours. I looked at him across the steam from my mug, oat milk, 1 sugar, the way he still made it every morning, and felt the familiar pull. Not of nostalgia for what was lost, but of gratitude for what we'd salvaged. The separate bedrooms that had slowly become one again around Thanksgiving, when holding each other through the night stopped feeling like risk, and started feeling like home. The joint therapy sessions that had become monthly check-ins rather than emergency repairs. The way we'd learned to say I'm scared, instead of I'm fine, when old doubts crept in during quiet moments. Yeah, I said. Let's do that. Pack light. He smiled. The small real one that crinkled the corners of his eyes. The one I'd missed more than I'd admitted even to Dr. Patel. And reached for my hand across the table, fingers lacing without hesitation now. The callus on his thumb from too much mouse clicking at the new job he'd taken after the startup finally stabilised a texture I knew by heart again. The rest of the morning unfolded in the ordinary choreography we'd rebuilt. Him loading the dishwasher while I packed lunches, turkey on whole grain for Liam, hummus wrap for Sophie. Both of us checking phones for the day's schedule, texting Mara a quick all good here. When she sent her daily check-in emoji, the house filling with the sounds of kids' footsteps overhead, and backpack zippers, and the inevitable last-minute search for a missing library book. When the front door closed behind them, and the school bus pulled away, I turned to Jake in the hallway, the quiet settling around us like a blanket we no longer feared, and he pulled me close, arms around my shoulders, chin resting on my head the way he always had. I still think about the hospital corridor sometimes, he murmured into my hair. The blue hat. How close I came to losing this. I pressed my face against his sweater, breathing in the familiar scent of his laundry detergent mixed with the faint trace of wood smoke that clung to him after winters at the cabin. I think about the cracked phone screen and the nights I slept with the ring box under my pillow like a talisman against hope. We both almost lost it. We stood there a long minute, holding each other in the patch of sunlight that slanted through the sidelight. No need to rush past the acknowledgement because we'd learned that naming the scars didn't reopen them. It let them fade into something bearable, even useful. Later that evening after dinner, takeout tie, because neither of us felt like cooking, we sat on the couch with Netflix paused on some documentary neither of us was really watching, my legs across his lap, his hand resting on my ankle, and I said the thing that had been waiting since the porch a year ago. I forgive you, Jake. Not because the hurt disappeared, but because I've seen you choose differently every day since you came back, and I forgive myself for the parts I blamed on me when it wasn't mine to carry. He looked at me, eyes steady, glistening just enough to show the words had landed. I forgive myself too. Not for forgetting what I did, but for believing I can be more than that one choice. We didn't need to say more. The quiet that followed was full instead of empty, the kind of quiet that holds space for everything that came before and everything still possible. When we went upstairs later, the ring caught the hallway light as always, but tonight it felt less like a question and more like an answer. Scarred, yes, changed, definitely, but stronger in the places we'd mended together. The bond, no longer fragile porcelain but something tougher, more flexible, forged in the slow burn of showing up when it would have been easier to walk away. We climbed into bed, doors open to the hallway as always now, his arm around me, my head on his chest listening to the steady rhythm that had once been the soundtrack of my nights, and then the silence I'd learned to fill alone. Tonight it was simply home again, not perfect, not untouched by what happened, but real, renewed, quietly hopeful in the way only hard-earned closeness can be. 1 year later, still choosing each other in the small, everyday ways that matter most. The future no longer a straight line we'd planned, but a path we were walking together, hand in hand, scars and all.